name is Dr. Craig Seal, and this is the first in a two-part video series on stress and well-being. The material is pulled from our chapter, Introduction to Organizational Behavior, Dolan and Lingham, Chapter 9, Stress and Well-being. When you listen to this video, it will be helpful for you to have the PowerPoints up. Again, Chapter 9, Stress and Well-being, as that will allow you to sort of follow along with the different parts of the video. This is a two-part series. The first part's going to focus on general stress and stressors, and the second part will focus more on the issues of consequences of stress, as well as stress and personality, and some ways people can better manage stress in their lives. So what is stress? Stress is a dynamic condition in which an individual is confronted with an opportunity or demand related to what the individual desires, and for which the outcome is both uncertain and important. What that means is, when you're interested in some kind of goal, and you're not really sure whether you're going to be able to achieve it, and it's important to you, that causes potential stress for individuals. If you didn't really care, or you knew what the outcome was, stress goes down. But if it's something that is important to you, and something that you're not sure how you're going to do, stress level starts to rise. It's a dynamic condition because it's changing. As we change and our environment changes, we have to adapt as well. And so some situations early on may be stressful. Later on, they become less stressful. So for example, let's assume that you're registering for a statistics class for next quarter. If you've already taken stats before and you need to pass this class, then that's going to potentially raise the stress level that you're going to experience going forward. But on the contrary, if you've taken stats before, you're comfortable with the material, you know you can get a good grade, your confidence level is high, and quite frankly you don't even really need the class to graduate, then the stress level goes down. So stress is this dynamic condition related to things that we want, but we're not sure exactly whether we're going to be able to get them. In terms of stress, the response that people have on these uncertain conditions is a fight and flight response. And so this is hereditary. This is our basic instinctual response to when there's danger. And in danger situations, we have to either gear up to fight those situations, or we have to be prepared to run away. And so the body has a response to it. All of a sudden blood flow increases, your palms start to get sweaty, your eyes dilate, and you start to get prepared for whether or not am I going to have to run away, or am I going to have to throw down with this individual. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending, this same biological response occurs when we're in a situation when fight or flight is really not appropriate anymore. So for example, let's go back to the statistics class. When you walk in that first day to your course, if this is a potentially perceived stressful event for you, your body's gearing up for fight or flight. But running out of the classroom or punching the professor is probably not the appropriate response. And so we have all of this energy that goes into our system, but we don't always know what or how to do with that energy. It's great for us in terms of a physical response, but not always so good for us in terms of an emotional or intellectual response to challenges that come before us. But this is what's happening to us biologically when we feel under stress. In terms of occupations, we take this a little farther into the idea of actual jobs, meaning what's the stress that is involved in your particular job? How do you feel about your job? How do you feel about your performance? How do you feel about your opportunities? How do you feel about the projects that you're working on? Is the job becoming intensely stressful for you? And are you able to manage and cope with that environment, cope with that stress, or not? Part of the issue with stress is this issue in terms of individual and situational factors. That is, a model of occupational stress is looking at job demands. What is it that you have to do? We have to meet these deadlines. We have certain performance metrics. There's certain tasks that need to be done. I have certain levels of responsibility. All of that flows into various job demands. Whether that actually leads to stress or not depends on the individual and the situational factors. Some individuals are able to handle certain kinds of job demands better than others. So for example, later in this term, you're going to have to make an individual presentation where you're going to have to stand up and talk to your peers about a particular issue. For some of you, that's highly stressful. because it's something that you're not comfortable with, you're not prepared for, and you're worried about. For others, same demand, but that's something that potentially they don't have as much concern over. Individual differences are going to decide whether job demands are actually stressful or not. Similarly, there are situational constraints. So in the sense of the individual presentations that you're going to do in class, what you'll find is after a couple happen, all of a sudden that sort of sets a tone. And that tone will help to change the stress levels for those who come after, because people will see this isn't so bad, some people do well, some people don't do so well, and so that potentially could lower the stress associated with that demand of having to stand up and perform. Similarly, social supports, organizational supports can help to buffer what would normally be a stressful demand for individuals. All of this leads to potential stress level. That is, job demands mixed or through the lens of individual and situational factors leads to actual stress level. How much stress do people feel in a particular situation? All this matters for management because we're worried about performance. Stress is neither good nor bad. It simply is. It's a potential motivating force. It's a way for employees to engage and get focused in on the job duties at hand. And so a certain amount of stress is actually helpful. And what you want to find in terms of management is what's that optimal stress level? What's that point in which employees perform very well in a particular job? If there's low stress, no stress going into the position, then people aren't very motivated. They're not engaged. They're not focused. They don't really care. If it's too much stress, too overwhelming, then they shut down. They're not able to perform well, and their performance level drops significantly. You see this in terms of athletes all the time. When they're practicing, they may be at a very low level in terms of performance, but in actual games, that performance level rises. But sometimes, say the heat of the playoffs or an Olympic event where you've got one shot at it, it's too much stress, and you'll see athletes start to fold or collapse under the pressure, and they don't perform as well. As a manager, your goal is to figure out what's that optimal point. How much stress do I need to put my employees under so that they perform well, but not too much so that it overwhelms them and so their performance drops? And it's difficult because not only do you have to consider some of the situational variables, but different people are going to respond differently. Again, back to the issue of having to stand up and present to your peers with an oral presentation. Different students have reactions to that. Some may need more support. Some may need more practice. Some may need more structure to make it less stressful to them so that they're at an optimal or high performance state rather than an overwhelming state where they shut down. Similarly, some may not take it seriously. Some don't see the event as stressful at all. And for those individuals, you may want to ratchet up a little bit in terms of the expectations to try to get them more into an optimal rather than a low or high stress environment so that performance is at its best. Now, as we mentioned, there's this issue of stress, which is slightly different than stress is a general condition that people feel in response to trying to achieve goals in which they're important but uncertain. But what specifically adds to stress are called stressors, and those become, to some extent, individually as well as situationally dependent. Meaning, again, not everything leads to stress. Things that lead to stress for you are stressors. And for some people, something like traffic, or a bad grade, or a ticket, or being late, all of that increases stress level, and so those are stressors for you. For other people, being a little late, not doing so well on a course, maybe getting a ticket, is really not that big a deal. And for those individuals, those same stimulations, those same contexts, doesn't provide stress. And so for each individual, it's important to understand what are the actual stressors that lead to stress. And these can be broken out into three groups. There's extrinsic, intrinsic, and then we'll talk a little bit about organizational factors. The extrinsics, these are the job context. In other words, how the job is actually done. And one issue that feeds into potential is this idea of role conflict or role ambiguity, meaning, do you know what you're doing? Do you get conflicting signals? Do you get good feedback about your performance? So when you go into a particular job or a particular role, if you're not sure or you're getting mixed messages, that potentially provides role conflict or role ambiguity, which can raise stress level. Another issue is appraisal and feedback. Do you know how you're doing, and or are you getting feedback that says that you're not performing very well? And so if you take, for example, an early midterm or feedback on a paper, and if it's either really vague, so you're not sure how you stand, or the feedback was poor, that also can potentially raise the stress level and serve as a stressor for you. Lack of career progress. Many of you are going back to school at this point in your lives because you're hoping it will help sort of jumpstart your careers later on. And you may have looked at the landscape and realized, I'm not going anywhere with this particular organization or this particular job. That lack of career progress by itself, that can be a potential stressor for some individuals. Change and pace. Huge implications in terms of stress. Some people don't like change. And when there's constant changes, new systems, new process, new management, new goals, that by itself is a potential stressor for individuals. Sometimes poor working conditions. If you're outside in the summers and it's hot and you're not well hydrated, those are all conditions of potential stress. Not liking your coworkers, not being in a good environment, not being in a safe environment, all of those are part of the job context or the extrinsic factors of jobs that can lead to employees. Intrinsically, the nature of the job itself, there's an issue of work overload and even underload, meaning do you have too much to do? That by itself causes stress. But also, believe it or not having anything to do can lead to stress, because you may be worried about your job, you may be worried about your productivity, you may be worried about why are you here. And so this overload, underload issue, again, depending on the individual, can be a source of stress or a stressor for that individual. Lack of job control, lack of responsibility, having too much responsibility without adequate control. We talked before in terms of leadership, this position in terms of supervisor. If you're a supervisor, do you have responsibility for others? If you do, can you actually control their particular behavior? Do you have power? Legitimate, formal power in order to enforce the rules of the organization. And so when you're in these positions where you don't have control, but you potentially have responsibility, that's another source of stress, and that's intrinsic to the job itself. Finally, there are some organizational stressors, some basic climate issues that impact how people feel in organizations. Organizations are generally either healthy or sick, meaning they either help to add energy. When you go to work, people are generally, for the most part, excited and happy, fulfilled. They leave work feeling like they've done a good job, they've been able to contribute. Other organizations are more what we would term sick, meaning they suck energy out of you. People don't like to go. They don't want to be there. They're so happy when 5 o'clock rolls around and they can get out of there. It's basically the job is sucking the life out of them. And in those kinds of climates, that raises the stress level. That is a potential stressor for different individuals. Sometimes management. And we talked in terms of leadership styles, focusing on people versus production. And is that appropriate to a particular situation? And so is your manager too much focused on people? Too much on production? Not enough on either? All of that can lead to potential stressors for different employees in different kinds of jobs. Organizations themselves have particular structures, and they generally are more organic or fluid, or they tend to be more mechanistic and formal. And in organic, you're not really sure what the rules are. That can lead to a lot of stress for individuals. In mechanistic, you know what the rules are, but that by itself becomes problematic, and there's a lot of process and procedures and paperwork that needs to be completed, which adds to the stress level. Technology itself, either having to adapt to new technology or not having adequate technology for the job at hand. And finally, deadlines, and are they realistic? And having deadlines, again, a certain amount of stress is important, but having unrealistic deadlines for particular job demands and particular environments may actually serve as distress or overwhelming to individuals. This completes the first part of our series.